Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session titled Cataloging Ethics, What They Are, Where They've Been, and Where They're Going. This morning, I'm going to introduce our speakers. The first is Devin McGee. Devin has worked at the Metropolitan Library System for the past 8 years as a library manager, cataloger, and currently as Assistant Manager of Collection Services. She uses her knowledge of customer needs and searching habits to help her make sure materials are easily accessible to staff and customers. Recently, Devin has delved into the ethics surrounding cataloging, especially around accessibility and naming conventions. Devin's eclectic education in journalism, biology, chemistry, and music has destined her for a future in librarianship. She received her MLIS from the University of Oklahoma. When she's not pursuing her love of creating records for the library, you can find her out in the community trying to save the world. Next up is Caitlin Pallone. Caitlin received her MLIS from the University of Oklahoma in 2016. Shortly thereafter, she began her position at the University of Central Oklahoma as a metadata and cataloging librarian. In her position, she enjoys her work with the Oklahoma Tornado Funnel and is the 2021 president of OKACRL. In her spare time, Caitlin enjoys reading, listening to music, and spending time with her family and 2 bad cats. Lastly is Jay Shorten. Jay Shorten is cataloger of monographs and electronic resources at the University of Oklahoma and the co-coordinator of the Oklahoma Tornado Funnel, the PCC program for smaller libraries to contribute naming headings to the Library of Congress Authority file. He was imported from Canada via Brooklyn, New York City in 1999. He is on Team Cat and is very fond of the mountain lion and all of its various cross-references. And my name is Elizabeth Skirpin. So this morning, really quickly, I just wanted to have a couple of definitions on hand, just so we sort of had a basic understanding of what all of these various words that we're going to be tossing around today mean. And the first up is ethics, which is defined as the moral principle that governs a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. And then cataloging ethics is defined as a set of principles and values that provide an intentional decision-making framework for those who work in cataloging or metadata positions. So the first question I want to pose to our panel this morning is, what is an example of cataloging ethics or ethical dilemmas that you face in your line of work?
I'll go ahead and start.
Perfect.
I think an example of something that I have faced recently would be cataloging or describing things that you are ethically against. And as catalogers, we are trying to make things findable for users, and it sometimes is very hard to catalog things that you don't necessarily agree with or come out against your principles in some way or another. My immediate reaction would be, oh no, we don't want anybody to see this, it's terrible. But there are people out there that information is important to them. They don't see things exactly like I do, and they may be looking for that. So I think that's one thing that I definitely struggle with in my day-to-day job. It's not something I encounter all the time, but when it's there, it's definitely something that I have to think, this isn't necessarily for me personally to watch this or read or, whatever the format of whatever it is you're cataloging is. So that's definitely something that I have to think about when I'm working.
I'll go ahead and kind of bounce off of Caitlin there. Yes, trying to make things, keeping the user in mind and trying to keep things so that the searches that they'll do will actually bring up the materials that they're looking for. One of the ones that is most prevalent in my mind right now is our genre headings, which are locally controlled. They're not the Library of Congress. We hadn't done anything with them for 25 years. And there was a push recently within more so within the publishing industry to do more with transgender characters. And our genre heading only said gay and lesbian, which was very limited. And that's kind of one of the dilemmas that we were facing. So we did actually go ahead and start a project. We haven't gotten the new genre headings in place yet, but now we were able to do things like LGBTQ plus, and other ones. So.
Okay, me, all right. Well, I do a lot of authority work, and lately I've been doing it for one of our, for the Western History collection, our special collections, to try to identify the people who are, who either donated a collection or are the subject of a collection. And I had a dilemma where where I was trying to find out if some of these people were dead or still alive. And I found one person was still alive, but the source was kind of skeevy. It was from the voter registration data, but I didn't like the look of the aggregator that did it, because it wasn't like directly from the data itself. So I am still not sure whether I should pretend I didn't see it or whether I should use it. I mean, the person is 96 though, so it's not like there's going to be some, you know, like I'm revealing their age or something, because they're trying to, you know, keep a job. But I don't know. That's my dilemma, and I haven't figured it out yet. So I just put it aside.
One thing that I think of when I'm doing authorities, Jay, and I'm wondering whether I should use something or not, sometimes it comes down to me of whether that information is going to help a user or somebody that's a cataloger come back and identify that person with their work. And if it doesn't help, then is it necessary?
Because the reason why I've been, for these ones, I've been more searching for names and dates. Like I've been using genealogical websites, it's because these people in many cases aren't authors. And so I want to try to, if I can provide birth death dates, that way if some other author comes along with that name, then it's not going to be confused. So that's why I'm thinking it, but it's easier if they're dead. Okay, that's a weird way to put it, but it is easier if they're dead, because then there's no privacy ethics involved in it. If it's public data, that's one thing, like the copyright catalog. So they've already provided that to somebody. So that is public data. But that voting list, I'm not sure how public that data really is supposed to be. That's why it's still, anyway, but that's the dilemma I have. Sometimes I don't know if there's a dilemma, but sometimes what I have a problem is with certain theses. I do educational theses, and it's always frustrating when you get students with disabilities or children with disabilities, or if there's a better term for it, I'm not sure what it is, but then they don't identify what the disability is. So that makes it very difficult for me to assign a proper subject heading, because, for example, if the student is blind and the user is looking for works on how to educate deaf children, it doesn't help anything to include blind children just because they're called children with disabilities. And sometimes I wish some of the people who write theses would be blunt somewhere in the thesis, so I could understand what it is. But I don't know if that's an ethical problem, but that's a problem I have. And Elizabeth, you might want to tell me when I've spoken enough.
I think you're great. I think this is starting some great dialogue over this topic. Devin, did you want to cap on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say to Jay, I think that is actually something, working in a public library, trying to find the exact terms. We use subject headings for nonfiction work as well, and trying to find the exact terms that would lead somebody who's looking for that specific resource. I agree. I think it is actually a ethical dilemma because you want to use terms that people who are looking for things will think to type in and look. So just kind of jumping on Jay's comment there.
Perfect.
I mean, it's just no good if nobody can find what it is you're looking for. I mean, a good authority file will have lots of references. So if somebody, for example, if they're blind and if that's not the proper term now, you will have the proper term. Or if somebody, and people won't have to remember all these terms because I can never remember them.
Yeah.
So, but then there's also the ethics about, well, you don't want to offend people with the terms. And we just had something like that with the University of Oklahoma for the Tulsa Race Massacre. The former heading was the Tulsa Race Riot. For whatever reason, I guess that's what it was called then. And it was actually established very recently, but the person who looked at it and established the heading, I guess at the time, Google, had more hits for race riot. That's, oh, wow, sound effects. Yes, that's a very good sound effect for how shocking that term is now. But, it's not... It's really not a nice term, and it can be very offensive because in a way, at first I thought, well, yeah, it was a riot, but it was the white people who were rioting. So, but now but we got the term changed to race massacre because unfortunately that's what happened. So, but that's an example of an ethical thing. What is the way of describing something that everybody can agree on, and sometimes there isn't, but that doesn't horribly offend or downgrade somebody's experience with it. And that's what the race riot heading did. There's another heading that we're trying to work on now with the librarians at the University of Arkansas for another race riot thing. And we're trying to get that changed to the Elaine Race Massacre or the LA Massacre. They have to determine which is the more common term, so we know what's the agreed upon term.
I think that is a great way to segue into our next question, which we've discussed a little bit, but I think we can certainly keep the conversation going on. What ethical decisions do you make in cataloging at your job?
That's definitely, I think, the biggest decision, the biggest ethical decision that catalogers work with is how to choose subject headings that will be descriptive, but also accurate. One thing that I came across in reading recently was something that was like telling you to ask yourself, when you're creating a record, would this metadata be considered accurate by the creator or the creator's community? And I think that's something that definitely when using Library of Congress subject headings is a challenge, and you have to think of creative ways sometimes to approach it in order to skirt around some of the problematic subject headings, like Jay mentioned, changing the Tulsa Race Riot to the Tulsa Race Massacre. There's very many subject headings that need revamping like that.
I love that, Caitlin, about thinking about the creator and the creator's community. I think that's a great guideline for all of this. Since we're a public library, we're still using the Dewey system for nonfiction, which has so many problems in itself. But just trying to think of where we will even actually put the book, because it's not even just the subject headings, which we also struggle with some, and thinking about who our end users are. But, for right now, we're putting anything to deal with African Americans as in the 300s, which is social studies, social science. instead of some of it going into history. And it's kind of difficult not to want to sort of change streams right now and think, is this really the best place for it? Are people going to go over to the 300s? Most likely they're going to want to look in the history section, and they're not going to find things there. So along with subject headings, just even where to place the item. Fiction's a little bit easier, but again, we've got those genre headings right now that are very restrictive. And although we are luckily changing those, it's a process and it takes a while. And so right now, if we don't have anything that fits, we just throw in no genre heading, but that makes the record almost useless for somebody to try to find something, because it doesn't give them any information about the item or the book, the material at all. So there's several different points at which, I mean, we're basically, even if it's subconscious, we're making those ethical decisions from the moment an item has come into our hands to when it goes back out to the libraries. And sometimes we're asked to reconsider that by the frontline librarians, and we do. We absolutely do. So we can't be experts on everything, unfortunately.
I think sometimes, especially the problem with multidisciplinary works is, where do you put it? Because you don't want to put it somewhere where it would be lost, as Devin said. And in a way you could almost do that, put something where nobody would think of looking for it, so nobody finds it. That would be unethical. Sometimes though, the item itself is trying to be unethical, and that's the flip side. Sometimes some people are trying to, like, especially with certain documents, things that people are trying to flub what it's about, like they're trying to say, kind of like be wishy-washy and mealy-mouthed, just so you don't figure out what it's about. And that's kind of unethical too. And so partly we're making the thing more ethical by putting out in the open what this thing is about.
I like thinking of it that way, Jay.
Well, that's a good point.
Just being honest about what the thing is about.
Yes, that's exactly it. It's more that ethical to be honest. I think that's the higher ethics of our calling. Even if it offends somebody, well, unfortunately, we can't help offending some people sometimes, because nobody agrees on everything. But you have to try to be, so you have to balance that out. You don't want to be completely offensive, but you want to be accurate. And the public is not served by inaccuracy.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, I don't remember who said it, but a good library will have something that will offend everybody. So yeah, the honesty in the work and how you put it out there, I think is really important.
It kind of goes back to my problematic dilemma of not wanting to catalog something that I didn't believe in. And it's not my job to say, that this should be there or this shouldn't, or it is my job to accurately represent that item.
Yeah, I agree.
Perfect. That feels like a good moment if anyone has any last comments before we move on. I'm hearing no objections. So our next question, and I do apologize in writing this question, I'm not sure that trend is the best word, but in your opinion, what is today's biggest trend in cataloging ethics? And I think what I was trying to get at with the word trend is, what are some of the issues that are cropping up repeatedly, maybe that we're hearing our peers in the field talk about as being something that we're paying more attention to, or perhaps it's something in your own library that you're paying more attention to or noticing more?
I definitely think that goes back to kind of what we've been talking about, is confronting cataloging standards that aren't reflective of the diverse users that we are cataloging things for. Also, going along with that, classification issues that are antiquated in LC and are here at UCO. We are undergoing a research project to see how we can correct some of the call numbers in literature, and that have point N39 to N6 or 07 call numbers, or subject headings for Native and Indigenous people. These are some of the big hot button topics we're talking about in our department here at UCO.
So unfortunately, I always get embarrassed when I see something with an N6.
Oh, it's awful. It's terrible.
But at the time, though, that actually wasn't an offensive term, and that's another problem, because the terms, unfortunately, they keep changing. And so one year, you know, one topic, one term is sort of okay, and then the next year, people, because certain people use it in horrible ways, people don't want to use that term anymore. And sometimes we don't have the time to keep changing these things and changing these things all the time. So I can understand why people have stuck with N6, you know, but it is kind of, you know, sometimes you sort of have to try to pretend you don't know what it means, which is kind of a bit dishonest, but it might, you know, and maybe that is unethical, but sometimes it's just, you don't want to go there right now because you want to just help them rather than create a fuss.
Really quickly, for the benefit of our audience, Jay or Caitlin, would either of you mind saying what N6 is?
Oh, it's the famous cutter when you have for peoples, or it means Negro.
Okay, thank you.
So that's what the term was then. I think modern, if you have a lot of things in history that will, you know, like say, you know, peoples of Oklahoma, you know, like, so you have English and you have, well, maybe you don't have French, but Spanish, and then you have Negro. It's like, oh dear. But that was what people said in 1900 something when the headings were established. Now, for more modern terms where you have, you will probably have, you won't have N6. I'm not sure what they will use in its place. Maybe something with A for African American.
Or B.
B for Black, that would be, yes, if Black American, well, or Black. And then then the other problem is, you know, it's like, you might want to say Black because in some, like in Britain, you wouldn't say African British unless they were actually from Africa. If they were from the West Indies, they would find that very strange that you know, and might be offensive in themselves. So that's the problem with the Library of Congress. Is kind of supposed, and Dewey too, it's supposed, at least Dewey is numbers. Numbers don't offend people, but cutters are words, and words can offend people. But the problem is they have to be universal. I mean, we can't, well, maybe we could, maybe we have to know what are the terms in each country so that we can use them, because in a way with those kinds of cutters, people don't really need to know what exactly it stands for. It's just a symbol to park them in. So it doesn't need to be universally N6 or B whatever for every single country too.
That's a really interesting discussion. Being a Dewey library, you're right, we don't run into quite the same. For us, it's more using the Library of Congress subject headings. And as far as biggest trends, I'm heartened by the fact that so many people are starting to take a more critical look at subject headings. And I know there are libraries out there that have felt that the Library of Congress isn't moving fast enough to modernize what's going on now, and have started doing their own subject headings, which I find really interesting as well. So I think our biggest trend right now is that people are just more aware that we're actually taking a critical eye and saying, you know, these are not only are they offensive, but they kind of obscure what the works are about. You know, one of the biggest things that I think, and you guys have probably seen this, is the Dartmouth College Illegal Aliens thing. And that actually, literally went to Congress where they debated that on changing it, because so many of the kids there, the dreamers at Dartmouth, were like, this doesn't actually give us anything. I mean, like, we don't identify with this. So yeah, so I think for me, at least in the limited cataloging that I've done in the past, it's been just the fact that people are now taking a critical eye to things. And I was very heartened when OU got the Tulsa Race Massacre subject heading in there. I thought that was wonderful and a good sign that everybody's looking towards this.
The one problem with the subject heading sometimes, though, is they always have to be a little bit behind the times, because you don't want to use a term that that is very fatty and trending and fashionable, but then next year it will just have gone by the wayside. The subject headings have to reflect usage and general usage, what most people or a great number of people will think of it as. And that's sometimes why it's they unfortunately have to sometimes wait for the general public to catch up with the ethics.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, then you have the problem with the illegal aliens, is that then it starts to become a political matter. And then you might have a political solution imposed on you, which is not necessarily the ethical solution, such as what the Library of Congress, went through. You know, Congress, well, they are the Library of Congress. Congress imposed on them the solution of illegal aliens. And we're stuck with that. Unless you can program your catalog to automatically display whatever it is. But if you don't have a sophisticated catalog like that, or sophisticated programmers who can do these magical things with your catalog. I mean, I could see OU might, and people, you know, big academic libraries, but say Stillwater Public Library, would their catalogers be able to make? They'd either have to change all the headings at once, which might be possible. That's a lot easier than it was before, but you know, they might not have the time either. So that's also a problem. Sometimes it's just the time thing, you know. And
yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of the stuff isn't necessarily scalable down to small libraries where there's one person, you know, who does everything literally at the small town libraries and relies on like Library of Congress or even vendor records, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity for things.
Yeah, that's the thing, that vendors might not, you know, be woke and change these things. So that is sometimes a problem that I see with people making their own subject headings, was unless you can do it for everything in your catalog, it's not useful. You don't want this one to say illegal aliens and this one to say, I don't know what they'd say, undocumented
Immigrants.
undocumented immigrants. And people will wonder, why on earth did they say two different things, you know? Or they may not wonder, but that means, you know, people won't be able to get everything in the, so that's also almost hiding things away. If you using some words for one thing and then for the exact same things you use other words.
Right. I did find it, just as sort of an aside, the illegal aliens issue that actually made it to the floor of Congress and was debated there was sort of surreal. You know, like as catalogers, we tend to be, you know, very insular, and to have us sort of thrust into the spotlight, even if it was just for a brief period of time, was very interesting, I thought.
Perfect. Does anyone have any last comments they'd like to make before we move on to the next slide, which will, of course, be related to this slide? Okay. Our next topic is, and I know that we've touched on this, but what are some of the issues or challenges surrounding ethical cataloging? And I think that we've touched on it in conjunction with our other topics, but it would be really great to sort of iterate out maybe perhaps what each of you handles in a day-to-day environment in your work.
Really day to day, the biggest challenge is making LC fit this, like how you and others should be describing things now. I mean, it, like Jay said, it does take a lot of work and time consuming work for these things to be updated. And if we need things to be standardized, we have to think sometimes around in the kind of a roundabout way on how we can ethically put these subjects out there in a you have to be very strategic almost into making the also describe what you're cataloging, but also in a way to go back before that the person who created it would think that it was described, like that record described what they created.
Yeah, I think we've really touched on a lot of these things. For me, the two biggest, I guess, on a day-to-day, and unfortunately now that I'm moved up into management of our collection services, I don't get to do quite as much cataloging as I used to, but we still face basically the inflexible parameters like Caitlin had mentioned, and just trying to think around those issues so we can try to make the best records possible. And like Jay said, changing course midstream, as it were, new terms come up and they don't change, or if you've got a whole collection that is all under a certain dewey number, or you've been using the same subject heading, although it's getting easier and to change things midstream, it's still really difficult, even for a large library that has its own dedicated cataloging section and global edits and all that kind of stuff. It's very time consuming, and we don't always have the time. I mean, it's always going to be a balance between getting materials out to the customers and doing the best cataloging job that we can along with that. So
I also think this isn't a new problem or one that's only associated with ethical cataloging, but it still touches on it. How do we know when our cataloging is unethical or when we're doing something that's unethical? What do I mean? Well, we're sometimes behind the scenes. A lot of us just do cataloging all day and we don't meet the public. Some of us are like 3 or 4 miles away from the library that we serve. So we don't see the public. So if the public is offended by something that we do, we can't know this unless we have very good communication with the reference librarians, and and they tell us. And sometimes in some institutions there isn't good communication, and in some cases it's not the reference librarians who would know it, it's the graduate students who, like for example, in an academic library, the graduate students on the weekends who would encounter this. And if they don't tell the reference librarians, then how are we going to know about it? I'm sure the public librarians might have a similar problem sometimes, but I think that's a problem. I mean, it's all very well to say we're going to be ethical, but you have to have feedback to know that you're being ethical, because sometimes you can go along and think, oh yeah, I'm such an ethical person, I'm being ethical, my cataloging all day long, and then you aren't, because nobody's telling you you're not.
no, you're absolutely right, Jay. And even in a public library, so our cataloging department is in a service center, which is miles away from any of the branch libraries. One of the things that we did this time around, which was really good, so the original genre headings that we did for fiction were just done within the cataloging department. When we decided to do the revisions, we included public service staff as well, librarians and access specialists, basically your circulation, people that actually get asked the questions, for Amish literature, or whatever. And you're absolutely right. It is crucial to get the people who deal with customers on a day-to-day basis involved in some of these things and not just be insular into ourselves. So yeah, I think it is a problem everywhere. And yeah, we're definitely removed from the end user. So yeah, I agree with you, Jim.
I have read some about doing catalogers doing user studies and to see how, you know, who you are serving, how they would search for things and what subject terms they would use, which I think is interesting, but also something that would take, you know, an inordinate amount of time and resources to be able to pilot any sort of study like that. But then again, like actually do something with the results. So
yeah, it's the hope of our department eventually to go out and visit the libraries as well. Of course, the pandemic hit, and so that's been kind of put on hold right now. But yeah, it is. And it is time consuming. Absolutely.
I have another quick question that's sort of come to mind as we've been discussing this topic. How do you and your libraries sort of balance the knowledge that we all have more catalog cleanup than we could ever find the time to do, with the knowledge that we also need to do it? Do your libraries have revisory schedules in which you're trying to clean up things, or do you take it project by project? I'd really love to know what other libraries are doing to tackle this.
I will say that for us, it's project by project. We've been fairly lucky with the pandemic in that work has been a little bit slower. It's been harder and more of a challenge to get materials in. It's starting to lessen somewhat, but we were able to use a good chunk of time for the catalogers to go in and update things and change it and kind of do some cleanup. There's a ton more to do, of course, and we don't have any formalized way of doing that.
I would say we definitely do project by project, but that's something that we have been actively, you know, trying with our research on the N607 call numbers, how we can bring more justice to our catalog and think about different ways we can correct some of the things that would be offensive if people really kind of realized they were there.
For me, it's project by project as well. You know, I mean, you have to stumble upon them sometimes, or somebody has to bring them to your attention. And if nobody brings it to your attention, how do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Thank you all. And so our next question, as we are beginning to wrap up, are what are some of the resources that attendees can utilize to learn more about ethics and cataloging?
One resource I learned when meeting with Jay and the group from OU that worked on changing the Tulsa race riot subject heading to Tulsa race massacre was the cataloging lab. I thought had a lot of interesting and good information on it. Another thing along the subject heading front that we do, we do some, you know, outside LC subject headings. One of our favorites around here is the Homosaurus. There's also the Indigenous Services Canada subject thesaurus. There's also a similar one in Australia. So those are the cataloging ethics steering committee page is another one that I've looked at.
Yeah, everything that Caitlin said. There are tons of resources out there, actually. And like Cataloging Lab, as she mentioned in the Homosaurus, there's another group called We Here that is.
Sorry, what is it called?
We Here, like we as in people, we, WEHERE. And it is a group that supports, I don't know how to say this, but minority or underrepresented librarians of color, of gender, you know, and they actually hold seminars on critical cataloging. as well as other ones dealing with social justice issues. And they're very interesting. I think it's wehere.org. There's also a couple of really interesting books out that you can look at called, there's one, Text, Lies, and Cataloging by Jane Brubaker. For those of you who grew up in the 80s, I remember the movie, but it was kind of clever. But that one's really great, and it's about deceptive works, which we've kind of touched on throughout this. And another one, Ethical Questions in Name, Authority, Control by Jane Sandberg was the editor of that one.
I've actually read that.
I thought it was very informative. I haven't delved too far into it, but I've been sort of, skimming bits and pieces of it. I think it's an amazing resource. And these both have just come out within the last few years. And there's lots of general ones too. If you're just trying to get your feet wet and going into, this kind of work, or thinking about ethical and social justice issues, like Project Ready and Hollaback, which does a bystander training, like what you see, but it's a really interesting look into lots of different viewpoints, I think. And of course, the one that kind of got me started on it was the whole Dartmouth College. There's a video, let me change the subject documentary on it. It's well worth Googling and looking up. It really kind of informed me a lot about how subject headings work and what people could do. And I, as a cataloger, I was always like, oh no, we can't do anything different than Libraries of Congress subject headings. And then I learned people are doing other stuff all the time. So it was really informative for me as well.
I can't add anything, sorry.
That's okay. That was an incredibly comprehensive list. Thank you, Devin and Caitlin, for that. And now we're on to our questions from the audience section. And I did just have a couple of follow-up questions based off of today's discussion. Are any of your libraries tackling ethical cataloging with local policies or library-only subject headings? So for example, have one of your libraries taken a look at something, I think some of the LGBTQ plus subject headings are a great example, and decided that the Library of Congress subject headings or even some of the liaised subject heading resources just don't fit your library and you've created your own? Or have you created local policies to decide not to use certain subject headings? I would really love to know what your libraries are doing on that.
Well, I can say from our library, we haven't really done anything official. I think each of our catalogers, thinks through the types of subject headings. And oftentimes the records that we get from OCLC are often really good as well, but somebody else has put that thought in. Except for, so we don't do anything different than the Library of Congress subject headings for nonfiction work, but we have taken the Library of Congress genre headings and made them our own. And that's the project that we're sort of, well, not quite in the middle of, towards the tail end of.
I personally don't do any. I know that my supervisor, Shay Beasley, has discussed with us working with some normalization rules in our system to, I'm not positive, but I want to say it was illegal aliens. She wanted to switch to undocumented immigrants in our catalog. So it's not something I personally actively do, but I know that that's something that we've been discussing in our library, in our department.
We have now what's called the metadata justice discussion group. What I'm hoping it will do is, bring to my attention other subject headings that might need changing. But sometimes I do have to say on the contrary, that the idea of people getting together and making their local subject headings implies that they have enough staff, cataloging staff or catalogers to be able to do this. And some libraries don't have it. Some libraries have outsourced all or most of their cataloging. So sometimes there's nothing you can do. Well, I mean, not that there's nothing you can do, but sometimes somebody does, there's only so many hours in the day for the person to work. and they may not have the time to do that.
And Jay, I just have to say, I love the added justice group. I still want to be a part of that. It just seems like they're doing amazing, interesting work.
Perfect. As my next question, and I had not previously thought of this, so this was very enlightening for me during our discussion. But do all of you struggle with your cataloging ethics working with your vendors? I know that my library, for example, doesn't necessarily utilize the catalog records that our vendors provide. We usually catalog everything from scratch. And so it's not something that I've thought of previously when you are utilizing vendor records, that they may not be up to par.
Well, for us, we can say we don't have the manpower. We'd have to use what they get. I mean, if we notice there's something wrong, we can change it, but we've got too many electronic book packages and things like that that are just, we can't see it all. Sorry, I mean, that was like an administrative decision from other people long ago.
And I think that as a brief interjection, I think that is something that catalogers struggle with, is it's not always what we would like to do, but it's also what administrative decisions are being made, and manpower is a huge part of that. It's very honest to say that we would like to change the world, but there's only so many catalogers and there are so many catalog records with each library.
Yeah, we've been pretty lucky. We have a fairly robust program here. There's 4 full-time catalogers, and then there's me and our boss, who also does some cataloging on the side, as it were. But yeah, the vendor records, they're hit and miss. But we do use vendor records for our ebooks, or e-materials, e-audio, all of that. And sometimes there's nothing there, or they put the wrong description in for the resource. And as Jay said, until somebody brings that up, we don't necessarily know to fix it. But for the most part, the vendor records we use, besides the electronic, are only just for our really big bestsellers like the John Grishams, and those can be pretty good. I mean, they're pretty straightforward. But we are lucky enough that everything else that we put in our libraries comes to the cataloging department, so we do have a little bit more control over what those records look like.
Sometimes I find that some vendor records, it's like whoever is doing them, it's like you're getting confused with what the purpose of the catalog is. It is not to sell your books. We're not a bookstore. We don't have to tell everybody that every book is the best thing that's ever written, and it's so useful and it's going to be a great help for you and blah blah. And sometimes you see in all these summaries that it's like, that's just useless. It's I don't know whether that's unethical, but if wasting people's time and being unhelpful is unethical, then it's unethical.
Yeah.
It's like we don't need to, it's more use of time to be able to just be very precise so that people can, like in our field, the idea is so that it's like unselling the book. So somebody could look at this, or they don't have to look at the book, they can look at the description and say, oh, that's not what I need. I don't want to call that one. I don't want to waste my time getting that one. And then they have a lot more time to look at the things that they do need to look at. And I think a lot of vendors don't realize that, we've already bought the books. We don't need to sell them,
Perfect. Thank you. Does anyone have any last thoughts before we wrap up? I'm hearing none. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Here is our lovely panelists' information, should you choose to reach out to them. And as I always like to say at the end of a presentation, similar to an airline, we know that you had so many options today, and we are so thankful that you chose to join our session and learn more about cataloging ethics. So thank you all, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.